Hi, everyone. My name is Chetan Hebbale, and I have one simple question for those of you watching this presentation. Do you know what the flood risk is for the area that you live in? For those of you in this class living in Washington, D.C., you probably haven't thought about it that much. But because of D.C.'s location between two tidal rivers, more than 12,000 properties are at risk of flooding over the next 30 years, with an expected sea level rise of almost 4 feet by 2080. While this may seem like a problem for tomorrow, for nearly 20% of the world, this is a threat that they are facing today. For the next 10 minutes, I'll be talking about how we adapt to risks like this. In my presentation, Engineering versus Ecosystems, Evaluating Climate Adaptation Approaches. I'll start this presentation overviewing the specific research question, setting the stage for the drivers of climate adaptation and current international efforts, and then dive into a case study of a town in the Fiji Islands that specifically wrestled with competing approaches to adaptation. I'll finally conclude with key takeaways. The main question I sought to answer was, when it came to climate adaptation, are engineering-based approaches like seawalls, riverbank reinforcements, or improved drainage more effective and economical than ecosystem-based approaches like coastal revegetation, protecting mangroves, and reducing deforestation? Why am I looking into this? On its current trajectory, we will be watching videos of climate disasters on our phones until one day it's our phone that's recording it. Just this last summer, a third of Americans experienced a climate disaster, while more than 85% of the world has experienced extreme weather events. This table from the United Nations sets out a range of likely temperature increases across different emission scenarios. It's looking highly likely that we will experience a 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature this century, even in a low emission scenario. Some models predict at least a 2.3 degrees Celsius rise, given how many greenhouse gases have already been emitted. What kind of threats will this cause? There are 4 main ones: heat waves, droughts, heavy precipitation, and sea level rise. These events get progressively worse as we go from 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. And if we hit 2 degrees, then almost 40% of the world will be subject to annual extreme heat waves. Nearly 400 million people will be exposed to water scarcity. There will be a 36% increase in extreme rainfall, and more than 70% of the Earth's coastlines will be flooded. So how are we preparing for this? The UN has established 2 bodies charged with this task. The Adaptation Fund was formed after the Kyoto Protocol in 2001 and has committed about $850 million to over 100 countries. The Green Climate Fund was established in 2010 after the Cancun Climate Summit and has spent about $3 billion on various adaptation projects. The goal of this research is to help these institutions prioritize which adaptation approaches have been the most successful to help inform their financing decisions. To do this, I conduct a case study of the Fiji Islands. The Fiji Islands is home to nearly 1 million people who are particularly vulnerable to flooding. In 2012, they had their first village become climate refugees and had to relocate due to rising tides and floods. Right now, there are more than 80 coastal communities that are expected to relocate if they are not sufficiently able to adapt to climate change. For this case study, I look at the Lamy town, which is part of the larger surrounding area of Suva, the capital, where more than half of the population lives. Here, there are multiple zones of flooding risk across coastal flooding, surface flooding, and river flooding. Recognizing this risk, Lamytown conducted an assessment through the United Nations Environment Program, comparing engineering and ecosystem-based approaches to see what they should invest in. The 3 engineering solutions they looked at were building seawalls with concrete, rock, and tires along unprotected shorelines, riverbank reinforcements using steel baskets like the ones pictured here, as well as dredging to remove extra sediment. The last one was improving drainage by building ditches along main roads and clearing out any block drains. The ecosystem-based solutions comprised of replanting mangroves as natural barriers to storm waves and stabilizing sediment, which is pictured here, replanting stream buffers that help reduce erosion and slow river flow, investing in monitoring and enforcement to make sure that these natural systems that they've protected stay protected, reducing upland logging, which will reduce hill slope erosion and flash flooding, and lastly, reducing coral extraction, which will nourish the beach and support sediment. The first dimension of this analysis is to look at how much the two approaches cost. In this graphic, you see the 10-year and 20-year costs. On average, you see that ecosystem-based approaches on the left are far cheaper than the ones on the right, with seawalls being the most expensive engineering approach and most expensive approach overall, and replanting mangroves being the most expensive ecosystem-based approach. But how effective are these solutions at adaptation? Is it worth the cost if it's more effective at slowing the impact of a climate disaster? This is the topic I'll delve into more in the key takeaway section. But right now, there is actually not an agreed upon method for quantifying the reductive capability of adaptation approaches against flooding. There's one landmark analysis that's based on the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which found that hard infrastructure provided superior avoided damages between 2 to 30%, compared to ecosystem-based adaptation approaches like vegetation, which reduced the wave height of between 0.25 to 3% in most circumstances. Using this analysis, the researchers in this study extrapolated that hard infrastructure from engineering-based approaches would more likely be somewhere between 25 to 50% effective at reducing damages, compared to about 10 to 25% for ecosystem-only approaches. Hybrid approaches fell somewhere in between. But what the researchers also found is that ecosystem-based approaches came with a host of additional direct and indirect benefits. These included things like sustainable employment to maintain biodiversity, aquaculture, transportation, access to clean water. Another major one was the combined mitigation effects by growing carbon sinks that can help suck carbon out of the atmosphere. The additional benefits include nutrient retention and recycling, even preserving cultural heritage that's found in these wild places. Pricing in these positive externalities, researchers calculated a cost-benefit ratio of 4 adaptation scenarios. An exclusive ecosystem-only adaptation approach yielded the highest cost-benefit ratio. For every dollar spent on this approach, $19.50 of benefits between avoided damages and community benefits were achieved. The next highest was a hybrid approach with an emphasis on ecosystem solutions, which saw a $15 benefit ratio. Only engineering approach was next at $9, and a hybrid approach with an emphasis on engineering solutions is at $8. Based on this analysis for Lamytown specifically, it looks like ecosystem-based approaches give you the biggest bang for your buck. But of course, there are a host of assumptions made about the effectiveness of these approaches, the economic benefits, and the costs. So taking it all together, what are the main takeaways if you're the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund looking to invest in adaptation projects? To do this, I conduct a SWOT analysis to look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of each approach. Ecosystem-based approaches have a strength of being more cost-effective and more durable long-term without much maintenance costs. It also provides carbon sequestration benefits and continued availability and access to essential natural resources. They, however, have the weakness of potentially not being as effective as hard infrastructure, with difficulty really quantifying their effectiveness and not being successful if they're not designed properly. They do provide opportunities for substantial economic and social benefits that incorporate community involvement and cooperation, but this method is threatened by competing pressures of human development, which come into conflict with reducing deforestation. Engineering-based approaches have the advantage of offering a higher degree of protection against flooding and not requiring as much space requirements as environmental conservation. Unfortunately, these approaches are very expensive to build and maintain, require continual upgrades as they get worn down over time, and can experience stability issues if they're not properly engineered into the built environment, into the natural environment. There are economic opportunities around construction, operation, maintenance, and upgrades, but these solutions can be highly capital intensive, which may actually increase emissions and hurt the overall climate adaptation effort. The call to action from this research is for the international community to coalesce around universal metrics to evaluate adaptation approaches, which is a pivotal challenge to effectively allocating climate finance going forward. One approach from 2 researchers is to calculate each solution's saved wealth, which assesses the total productive assets and other forms of property that are safe from destruction, as well as saved health, which leverages the concept of disability-adjusted life years that's used in public health policies. Ultimately, metrics to holistically analyze the monetary and non-monetary costs and benefits of adaptation methods are badly needed, as the world has little time to plan for how they will brace for the inevitable environmental impacts of a 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius rise. Thank you. And further on here are my slide notes and bibliographies attached to the various slides for further reference. Thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation.